Good morning. Janine,
Yes, Vice Chair.
we ready to go?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. My name is Doreen Diadamo, and I am Vice Chair of the State Water Board. Today is Tuesday, January 4th, and I would like to call this meeting to order. First of all, by just notifying everyone that our chair is following the meeting, but he is experiencing some technical difficulties this morning. So that's why you're seeing me running the meeting instead. I'll begin by introducing our board members and staff. And with us today are our fellow colleagues, board member Sean McGuire, board member Laurel Firestone, and board member Nicole Morgan. Also, our board executive staff, Executive Director Eileen Sobeck, Assistant Chief Counsel Andy Sawyer, Chief Deputy Directors Jonathan Bishop and Eric Oppenheimer, and clerk to the board, Janine Townsend, and assisting her are Courtney Tyler and Margie Argel. I also want to let you know that this meeting is being webcast and recorded, so when you speak, please say your name clearly into the phone or your microphone on your computer. Also, as a result of the COVID-19 emergency, we are conducting today's board meeting via video teleconference in order to comply with public gathering limitations and physical distancing requirements, and as authorized by the governor's executive orders, there is no physical meeting room. For people who only want to listen or watch the meeting, the board's customary webcast is available. We are receiving presentations and public comment through a Zoom meeting platform. If you intend to present or comment or think you may be interested in commenting, you should already be in the Zoom meeting room using the meeting ID provided on the board's website and the password you received from the clerk. If you've not already received a password, you can email the clerk now at commentletters@waterboards.ca.gov, and she will email you a link to sign up on the virtual speaker card list. For those in the Zoom meeting, you will be on mute and your camera turned off until it is your turn to speak. The clerk will then unmute you and ask you to turn on your camera if you have one. When you are finished speaking and the board members have completed asking questions, you will be placed on mute and your camera turned off. All right, with those notices, we're on to our public forum, and the board will now hear from any person wishing to speak about any matter that is not already pending before the board. Do we have any speaker cards, Ms. Townsend?
At this point, neither one of them that are in the virtual speaker list are on the platform at this time. Let me just check to make sure one more time that they have not come in yet. And I don't believe they have. So our public forum is closed.
All right. Okay, well, we'll now move on to the board's business. We will consider the minutes from the December 7th, 8th board meeting. And I will entertain a motion.
I'll move to adopt the meeting minutes.
I'll second.
All right, Ms. Townsend, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Board Member Morgan.
Aye.
Board Member Firestone.
Aye.
Board Member McGuire.
Aye.
And Vice Chair Diadamo.
Aye.
Thank
4-0, the motion carries. Thank you. We will now move on to items 2 will be taken up and voted on unless there is a request for it to be removed from the uncontested calendar. Do we have any cards, Ms. Townsend?
I have no speaker cards.
Okay. Would any of the board members like to make a motion on uncontested item 2?
I'll move to adopt item 2.
I'll second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Ms. Townsend, please call the roll.
Board Member McGuire.
Aye.
Board Member Firestone.
Aye.
Board Member Morgan.
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo.
Aye.
Thank you all.
All right, motion carries. Uncontested item 2 is adopted. Next item is our informational item on the drought update. And I believe we have Mr. Ekdahl leading that off. Good morning. You're on mute. You're still on mute. We
Hold
can't
on
hear
one
you.
moment.
Okay.
There we go. You should hopefully be able to hear me now.
Yes.
Yep,
Good morning.
I temporarily wasn't allowed to unmute myself. Good morning, Vice Chair Diadamo and members of the board. It's January 4th, 2022, the start of a new calendar year, if not a new water year. And at this drought update, we have some relatively good news for the first time, I think, in a long, long time. The precipitation that we got over the last couple of weeks has really had a beneficial effect on storage and stream flows. And while we're not out of the woods by any means, and in fact, we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, it's been a very welcome and very positive couple of weeks for our water supply conditions in the state. Next slide, please. So the first bullet, recent and forecast storms have provided just a really fantastic boost. I think for a rough comparison, we had about between 6 and 7 inches of rain in October and early November in Sacramento. And as of yesterday, our rainfall total was about 14.5 or 15 inches in Sacramento. Other parts of the state have seen significantly more than that, and part of the Feather River and the Sierra watershed, over 35 inches of rain just in the last 3 months. And in the North Coast, in the kind of temperate rainforest parts of the state, even more than that, but that's relatively more expected. However, as we noted, we're not out of the woods yet. The long-term forecast still does call for increasingly dry conditions. And if we look at the kind of short and medium-term forecast for the next 2 weeks, at least in the Central Valley, there's some precipitation forecast largely to the north and north of Lake Shasta today and throughout the week, but then things tend to dry out a little bit after that. There will be a much more thorough and rigorous discussion on particularly the Bay Delta hydrologic conditions at tomorrow's workshop as part of the discussion on the proposed 2022 Temporary Urgency Change Petition, or TUCP, and the discussion on the staff draft reconsideration order for the previous 2021 TUCP. We'll have speakers from the Department of Water Resources, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. We'll have a discussion on some of the project's modeling capabilities and some of the forecasts and just what things may look like for the rest of the year. So we won't go into a lot of detail on Bay Delta today. That will be discussed in much more detail tomorrow. And we encourage people who might be watching this webcast right now to tune in tomorrow as well. We'll then run through our typical updates on Mill and Deer, Russian River, Scott Shasta, and then turn it over to colleagues in the Division of Drinking Water and the Division of Financial Assistance. Next slide, please. As noted, for the Bay Delta, there will be a more thorough discussion tomorrow. I do want to note that even with the fantastic precipitation we've had, a lot of that it's been relatively cold. A lot of it's come as snow. And there are still some stream systems where there may be additional needs for curtailments, particularly if things continue to dry out over the next 2 weeks. We run the curtailment analysis every day based on information from the California Nevada River Forecast Center. And at present, all of the curtailments in the Bay Delta watershed are temporarily suspended through at least the remainder of this week, and we'll reassess early next week where things are and update accordingly. Next slide, please. A brief update on some of the other reservoirs. Again, the main reservoirs will be covered tomorrow as part of the project's operation. Kachuma Reservoir is about 48% of capacity, but nearing 80% of average, which is a fantastic number for this time of year. Diamond Valley, about 74% of capacity, and San Luis, Still relatively low, 29% of capacity, but creeping up a little bit, about 50% of historic average. Next slide, please. Term 91 is currently lifted. So term 91 is not in effect right now. The significant storms that we've had over the last couple of weeks in particular, you can see that there is excess water and there's a lot of outflow through the Delta right now. So term 91 is not in effect. Next slide, please. We'll briefly highlight Mill and Deer Creeks. Those emergency regulations and curtailments are self-adjusting. So when there is sufficient flow for diversion in those watersheds, diverters can divert to storage or for other beneficial uses. And the 50 CFS flow targets, which were established as part of the emergency regulations, have been met consistently and throughout the implementation of the emergency regulations. There was a brief hiccup where there was some anomalous readings due to a faulty gauge, but that has been corrected and everyone has been in compliance so far. Next slide, please. In the Russian River, we continue to see a bit by bit improvement in the right holders who have received a curtailment order and whether or not they've responded to the response surveys. We're at 92% now. We've shown some slides, I think, back in early December that compared that response rate to the volume of water, and the volume of water relative to the percentage of responders, almost all of the water use is accounted for in the 92% of respondents. I think it's over 99.5% of the claimed or reported water use is covered. So we're having a really fantastic response rate in the Russian River. Again, all of these responses and the kind of response to the orders is available on our public Power BI dashboard. Next slide, please. You can see as of a couple days ago, flows in the Russian River were pretty high, up over 5,000 cubic feet per second. You can compare that to where things were a year ago, multiple orders of magnitude greater, again, just reflecting the better conditions. And when we go to the next slide, I believe that shows the change in storage relative to last year. We're at about 40,000, a little bit over 40,000. I think by this time, we're probably closer to 41,000 acre feet of storage in Lake Mendocino. That exceeds the high point for all of last year. So that, again, is a fantastic improvement in the Russian River watershed. And by all indications, I think things in Lake Mendocino will continue to creep up over the next couple of days, if not weeks. And hopefully we'll be in a much, much better position by the end of April or May of 2022. Next slide, please. In the Scott and Shasta, we've had a couple of additional developments since our last December meeting. On December 17th, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife submitted a memo essentially noting that the minimum flows in the Shasta River could be reduced to 135 cubic feet per second for the remainder of December. That was a step down from, I believe it was 150 that was required. And while it may seem, the change of about 15 CFS is relatively small, that does have significant implications for storage and the availability of water throughout the rest of the year if the rest of the fall and winter, or sorry, if the winter and spring do emerge to be dry. So we did modify the in-stream flow requirement. We lowered it from 150 to 135 through an addendum, and that applied through the remainder of December. The January flow already went from 150 down to 135, and so we're maintaining that 135 in-stream flow requirement. Based on the recent storm and precipitation, we have lifted or suspended all curtailments in the Shasta through January, so long as flows are at or above 135 CFS. So again, that's a significant change there. In the Scott, however, there are still curtailments in effect, and we continue to evaluate what flows look like in the Scott, but at present, we're continuing to keep those curtailments in place. We continue to meet with interested parties to discuss potential local cooperative solutions and continue to review and act on petitions for human health and livestock needs and in-stream uses. Next slide, please. A couple of slides just to show kind of where things are in the Scott and Shasta. You can see in the Scott, required flows are about 200 CFS. In January, that actually goes up from 150 CFS in December. And you can see that we're not quite meeting that in-stream flow target, even with the recent precipitation. Although, again, they're supposed to get, I think, a significant storm last night and today, although much of that is falling as snow. There have been about 1,300 adult Chinook and 800 adult coho observed returning to the Scott. And as of January 3rd, the flow was 132 CFS. Next slide, please. In the Shasta, you can see the blue line indicating that flows are above the minimum in-stream flow target. And so at present, we've temporarily suspended all curtailments. About 7,000, a little under 7,000 adult Chinook have been observed returning into the Shasta. Next slide, please. Additional information, again, referring folks to our drought webpage and our email subscription list. And I'll pause there for questions on this portion before turning it over to colleagues in the Division of Drinking Water.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ekdahl, for that welcome news. Any questions? All right, we'll move on to the Division of Drinking Water.
Hey everybody, this is Eric Zuniga, the Drought Response Program Manager. Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, board members. Good morning, everyone. Wanted to give an update. Things have been quieter as can be expected, but I wanted to give an update on where the Division of Drinking Water is right now. Next slide. So we've had a drop in the number of emergency water systems as water systems stop relying on hauled water and start moving into the more drought warning, where we identify some long-term projects to build resiliency for those systems. So the drought warning is increasing. It doesn't mean there's more drought warning necessarily being added. They were just from the emergency moving to the warning side. The drought watch is pretty stable at 112 water systems that were issued a drought monitoring order. And that's the current status of what we have. We expect that it'll continue to diminish. We don't really have a mechanism of taking people off the drought monitoring order as of yet, but we will continue to assess conditions and figure out when that would be appropriate. Next slide. So continuing from the last update that we provided as DDW, we did a data dive into a couple of the indicators and tried to figure out what those indicators meant in terms of, how bad is this system really in terms of what they've reported to us. So we've looked at receiving hauled water. We've looked at, who was expecting a water shortage within 30 to 90 days. So we looked at that. So the three data points I'm going to look at this time and kind of dive into is PWS daily production, looking at how much total daily production that they had during a time period. In this case, most of them are weekly. In that weekly, they had a daily production, and which ones had the most negative percent change. What we found is that right around 10%, if someone dropped 10%, they typically reflected the top 5% worst daily production. So those ones are the ones that we looked at as being kind of like the worst case of that group. And so I'll go over that in the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. So yeah, this is the daily production, and you could see of the daily production, we had one of them as a drought emergency. We had 6 of them drought warning and 23 drought watch. So not all of the drought watch ones were identified, but again, we didn't use this indicator, but this is a very good indicator to use. You could imagine that if somebody drops 10% in their source production, it may only take maybe 10, 15 days for them to completely run out of water. And so, we're going to try to use these metrics to try to figure out, where's the 30-day cutoff, where's the 90-day cutoff, which gives us enough time to step in and do something for them there.
Mr. Zuniga, can I ask a question? Is Sure. This, just so I understand, so this daily production, is this production capacity, or is this amount of water the public water system's actually producing and delivering to its customers? Or what can you explain a little bit more about this metric so I understand?
Yes. So they actually reported to us production values. So they reported how much they produced from each source. So what we did is we aggregated all the sources that a water system has. and we put them all together, and that was their production. We divided them by 7 days if they reported in 7 days to figure out how much they produced roughly each day, and then we compared each of the periods to themselves. So yeah, it's a totalized production across the whole period and all the sources.
So it might be a little tricky to tease out, just thinking about our water conservation efforts and how we're emphasizing that. And so if folks are using less water, of course, the production numbers will go down as well. So anyway, just that helps to understand where you're coming from. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. And the hope is with enough data, we could normalize for some of those efforts and figure out, what is something that is out of their control and something that maybe they instituted themselves. So one of the questions we'll ask in the future is, are they instituting conservation measures? What type of conservation measures? If we see a drastic change between one period or another, can that be explained with some of the actions that they took, or perhaps new sources came online, or just something changed in the system somehow? So yeah, I think that's a good comment. Thanks. Let's go on to the next slide, and we're going to look into. So this is groundwater source. So we just looked at, we try to split out groundwater sources from surface water sources. And so the groundwater sources we looked at, and I think the groundwater sources ended up being at 32%. They represented the top 5% sort of worst percentage records. So this is that snapshot of those systems. They're the ones that have, so I mean, if someone lost all their groundwater sources, they may have other sources. But in particular, we're looking at the behavior of their groundwater, so we can split that out and kind of tell them what the health of their groundwater source is. So the idea would be one day, someone could log into their next report and say, hey, based on the trend of your past reports, this is the source health of your groundwater sources. And we might be able to give them some more information that helps them make better decisions when it comes to, water shortage contingency plans and the like. So yeah, we had 1 drought emergency here, 4 drought warnings there, and 16 identified as just drought watch. So again, this will help us to inform it in the future, so we can kind of flag some of these issues before they become more egregious. Next slide, please. And finally, this is the surface water. So much less water systems that were reliant on surface water that were in our data set. But we had 5 of them on drought warning, 7 on drought watch, and this represented about 25% reduction, was sort of the top 5% of the records. So so we kind of looked at that, and that represented about 12 total systems that were in that top 5%. So yeah, again, we want to utilize the data to flag these people and to flag us as staff to make sure that they're aware of the drop in production, and that again, it's not something that they can control, or there's something they can do about it, or maybe something that they planned, that we can communicate that to them. Next slide, please. Okay, so our lessons learned and what our planned improvements are. So we want to do an automatic calculation of when the system would run out of water based on the current percentage drop. 7 days, and then the next 7 days. Based on that percentage drop, we want to sort of estimate out when we believe the system would run out of water. Kind of keep that as a theoretical metric based on what they've reported to us. So the results will be displayed for both DDW staff and the water system for planning purposes. So for example, it might take 66 days for a 1,000 gallons a week total production to go dry if it drops by 10% daily. So just some interesting math of, we can use some of the data that we get to inform when we think a source or production is gonna completely dissipate. Again, it's just a metric. It's not an exact science, as you are well aware. Also, automatically calculating or classifying systems who show a high percentage drop in source production as a drought warning system, and therefore allowing us to identify some projects that could potentially help that system, get some short-term to long-term drought relief funding identified for those systems, so we can catch them before they fail. For example, if an outage is predicted in 90 days, we'll put them on the drought warning list and follow up with funding and other things. And then some general improvements. So automatically classifying systems for drought reporting based on self-reported information as well as risk analysis metrics. So we're kind of using both what they've told us and what we see in the data, which is sort of they told us, but they weren't necessarily aware of what the data was telling us. So we're going to try to use those together to help classify systems properly. And then the next update, I'm going to look, it's probably the last update of the data that we have, but I'm going to look at the data analysis between depth changes, so static water level changes and reservoir level changes over time, and look at, how that informed, whether a system performed well or did not perform well last summer. Next slide. So moving on to the other updates that I have, this is an issue that came over the Christmas time, over the holiday season. We had some water haulers identified that were having trouble finding sources of water. There were some large water purveyors that stopped water haulers from delivering water outside of the area. So our EMP program is working on developing a map where we can identify nearby water systems that are able to deliver hauled water. And this is hauled water to domestic wells, it's hauled water to state small water systems, and potentially also some small water systems that might need hauled water for different reasons. So this is an issue. We're still trying to get to the bottom of it. Everybody has water as of now, but we are working on a more permanent fix to have a system in place so that everybody that potentially runs, their well goes dry, that they have a water hauler that can help them. And this is mostly located in the Central Valley with SHE. So you can think of about 8 counties affected down the Central Valley. So we're going to keep an eye on that. Hopefully I'll get a better update on the next time with some good news. The second one is data coverage. So we have our new data reporting tool. Now our last development cycle ends on January 12th. So we should have a fully functioning, complete data reporting tool by the 12th. And then what happens after the 12th is we start a beta testing period. The beta testing period is going to be, user acceptance for water systems and also for staff to test it out, make sure there's no bugs before releasing. We want people to have a really good experience with this tool. Since we had extra time to build it, we want to be able to roll it out with at least amount of bugs as possible. And of course, ongoing enforcement review of water outage related violations, those are still ongoing. And I believe that's it. The next slide is for questions.
Thank you for that report, Mr. Zeniga. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry, I'm about to sneeze, but
Take your
it's
time.
gone now. I think it's gone now. Okay, so I guess I wanted, the great update, so much going on. I really appreciate that. And hopefully, it seems like we are really creating the systems we need to be proactive in helping systems, prevent outages and making sure that our assistance can be focused and targeted on those that are really in the most dire needs before they're, folks are really impacted. My two questions are, and maybe more comments for as we evolve things in the future. So one of the things you mentioned was that we haven't yet figured out how we would remove people from the different lists. I think you talked about downgrading to a watch, but we haven't really figured out if you've ended up on one of these lists, when might you go off? And I think that, I appreciate you all being thoughtful about that, because I think it's a big policy question, really. And I would just say, we have a new law around drought contingency plans. And certainly I think if you've ended up on this list, you need a drought contingency plan. And you really should be submitting some kind of project or identifying what project you're going to be putting in place to not be in this position in the next drought. So I just wanted to signal that those would be things I would want us to think about in that process. And then I also think in this, I know we're going to be talking about emergency conservation in the urban context in the next topic and or agenda item. And so I think one of the areas I'm really interested in is what we are both requiring for emergency conservation measures to go into effect if they're on this list, and then understanding also when they're no longer in the highest category, but they're still on these drought watch lists, really looking at what the longer term or continuing conservation is being put in place to keep them from moving up. So I think those are all important policy questions just to be thinking about as we, hopefully can continue to avoid and prevent folks from losing water altogether. And then, so, overall, I think just a policy discussion would be helpful on how we're moving forward on thinking about requirements and order changes for these different levels now that we have more of a system and experience with this. And then the other just overall comment I have is just, and I shared this before, if there's systems on these different lists, even the watch list, I hope that we are, in addition to working with the system and, technical assistance providers on the ground, which I know we're doing, I also think it's really important that we're reaching out to, the management agencies for the surface water and groundwater sources to make sure they're aware of systems that are at risk and can help them with that management. And it may be that they already know, but certainly, groundwater sustainability agencies and whatever surface water, regional surface water agencies. I think it's important for them to know, areas in their jurisdiction that are really at risk, as well as, ways so that they can be thinking about ways to help prevent outages within their own areas. So yeah, I really appreciate the work, and thanks for this really informative update.
Thank you, Board Member Firestone. Great comments. Obviously, I think we're all on the same page. We're all thinking about the same things, working on the policy of, how does someone move from one end to another, and what do we do once we get there? And I wanted to let you guys know that I did submit some initial language for requiring a water shortage contingency plan as an enforcement action. Obviously, they're not required to do that until 2023. But with the legislation in place, it might be possible that we can require someone to do it early and require them to follow it. If it hits a 30% trigger, they have to do the 30% actions to get down to 30% so that they don't run out of water. And I think that is sort of one of the future enforcements we've never done before. We're running it by legal and seeing, how we can implement something like that. And I think that doesn't go into place without a corrective action plan, which is really, what are you going to do to get out of this 30% drop permanently? And what sort of actions are triggered from that? So I think those two in conjunction are going to do a lot, to allow us another tool in our tool belt to help these water systems conserve. And thank you for your comments. I think the GSA comment is also really appropriate. It might be something that we can start to involve them on, letting them know, what issues that they could be facing with other people also that are around those systems as well.
Thank you for those questions, Board Member Firestone and Mr. Zuniga. And I just like to chime in here. I especially appreciate, Board Member Firestone, your comments about coordination with GSAs. I would throw in there the management zones as well. And of course, you already listed the surface water agency. So A lot of times we just assume that that coordination is occurring, but there's just so much going on. So anything that we can do to help connect folks, I think would be helpful. Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, back to Mr. Ekdahl.
Let's see, I believe we have an update from the Division of Financial Assistance.
Yeah, good morning. I will be providing that portion. This is Matt Pavlicek. Good morning, Vice Chair and fellow members of the board. Again, my name is Matt Pavlicek. I'm the Senior Engineering Geologist over the Cleanup and Abatement Account and Emergency Drinking Water Unit with the Division of Financial Assistance. And today I'll be providing a brief update on drought-related funding. Next slide, please. So this map shows all of the urgent drought projects that we have committed funding to since July 1st. It's a total of 14 projects for just under $2 million. And as a reminder, we are continuing to coordinate very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Water Resources, who also receive drought funding on urgent drought response, as well as the development of county level or regional scale programs to assist those served by state small water systems and domestic wells that have gone dry. Next slide, please. Let's see, so this map here shows the State Water Board funded existing regional and statewide programs that are available to help with drought response for services such as well repair and replacement or provisions for bottled and hauled water. There's still about $42 million available in these programs to assist. Additionally, we have technical assistance that's provided across the state through a number of funding agreements with various technical assistance providers. These TA agreements could potentially also assist with drought-related issues, and there's still approximately $54 million remaining in those programs as well. And then as a side note on the technical assistance, there was a request for qualifications that was recently posted for new drinking water technical assistance providers as part of the recent legislation, naming technical assistance providers as an eligible entity for direct funding from the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. And there's more information available on that on our webpage. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes our drought funding activity since July 1st. We've committed funding to 5 urgent repair projects, plus 9 emergency well repair projects through Self-Help Enterprises technical assistance program for a combined total of just over $1.9 million. We've also added an additional $22.8 million to our existing regional programs. And we've provided interim solutions to 10 communities so far that are specifically related to drought issues. And that provided assistance to over 7,500 people. Next slide, please. So going into a bit more detail on the recent funding approvals. For urgent drought projects, we added some additional funding to 2 hauled water programs in Shasta County while we continue to coordinate with the Department of Water Resources and Shasta County on implementing a more regional scale program. Through the Self-Help Emergency Fund program, we recently approved a well repair project for Lanier CSD and also approved a well repair and installation of temporary storage tanks for the Tooleyville Mutual Water Association. And then more recently approved a project for Home Garden CSD that I'll cover on the next slide. On December 17th, we amended the Self-Help Dry Well Tanks and Hauled Water program that was executed and added an additional $7 million in funding to the original funding agreement. And then for our county program coordination between the State Water Board and the Department of Water Resources, between our 2 agencies, we are in discussions with about 15 interested counties, and the State Board is currently working closely with Yolo, Santa Cruz, and San Bernardino counties to develop regional scale programs. Next slide, please. For today, I wanted to highlight our recent work with the Home Garden Community Services District. They serve a small, severely disadvantaged community with a population of about 1,700 people. The photos on the slide show the newly installed well column with a PVC stub to allow for future water level measurements. This water system has 2 active wells and 1 standby well. According to water level data, the standing water level in their primary well had dropped to 72 feet since April of 2020. With current trends, it was anticipated that the operating water level would drop below the pump bowls, resulting in a water outage. The proposed project was about $86,000, and it included 2 phases. The first phase lowered the pump in the primary well about 40 feet to prevent an immediate water outage for the community. However, the current pump was undersized for the newly installed depth. The second phase replaced the pump with a properly sized larger pump, performed necessary electrical upgrades needed to operate the larger pump and the arsenic water treatment plant that is on site, and added an additional 60 feet of column pipe to the primary well. And the second phase of this project was completed in November of 2021, and Home Garden's risk of being out of water due to declining water levels has been abated. Next slide, please. And then just lastly, here are some links to various drought funding resources from DFA and also the Department of Water Resources. And then we are available for any questions. And if not, I'll hand things back over to Eric to continue his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Pavlicek. Any questions? All right. Thanks for the presentation. And Mr. Ekdahl, did you have any closing thoughts?
No closing remarks or closing thoughts. I think we can turn it back over to you.
Okay. I just want to open it up one more time to the board members. Any questions? Okay, I'll just comment that I appreciate the report and the good news, and really appreciate just the ongoing effort, regardless of how much precipitation we have. I think we've all gone through just sort of the shock of how bad things were last year. And so it's important to continue to plan, continue to assume that these great conditions that we've had may not continue in the months ahead, and appreciate your comments on that, Mr. Ekdahl. And that brings us to our next item, item number 4. And I just lost my computer screen here on the consideration of a proposed resolution for drought-related emergency regulations pertaining to urban water conservation. And as our staff is pulling up, I'll just make the comment that it may seem oddly timed that we're bringing this forward today, especially in light of all of the good precipitation that we've received. But just keep in mind that the administration has used a measured approach on conservation, and the decision was made back in, I think it was the end of November, because of the extremely dry conditions that we were seeing, that it was an appropriate time to move forward with some of these restrictions. And despite all of the good weather that we've had, of course, we can't assume that that'll continue to be the case. So I think it's important that we continue forward with consideration of the proposed regulations. And with that, I will turn it over to our staff.
Thank you, Vice Chair DiDamo. Good morning. My name is Mariel Rodero, and this month I am going to be tag teaming with Chris Yoon to present a combined item from the Office of Research, Planning and Performance's Climate and Conservation Unit. So I'll actually be starting with the Urban Water Conservation Update for November, and then Chris will go over the proposed Drought Conservation Emergency Regulation. Next slide, please. Oh, that's me. So let's start with the November Conservation Update. Just a quick note before I begin, I will be providing these updates at the first board meeting of the month going forward, rather than the second one. Next slide, please. So despite a dry November, we did see some benefit from late October storms, as well as ongoing conservation efforts. resulting in less residential use. So November 2021 residential consumption is 78 gallons per capita daily, which is about where we were during the height of the last drought in 2015 and 2016. Next slide, please. We saw 6.8% statewide savings for November, not quite as impressive as October, but compared to previous months on record, we are doing better, particularly considering that there is less room for conservation in the cooler months. So as of November, we're looking at 6% cumulative savings relative to 2020. Next slide, please. When the statewide results are further broken down geographically, we can more clearly see how much of an impact that rain can have. The biggest savings are seen in the northern parts of the state. So the North Coast, Sacramento, San Francisco, North Lahontan, and San Joaquin hydrologic regions all achieved more than 15% savings in November. The savings get progressively less as we move southwards, with the South Coast hydrologic region showing a slight increase of 0.8%. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, the bulk of October storms hit the northern part of the state. And as we can see in the comparison between the end of October and the end of November drought maps, it really made a huge difference, bringing much of the northern Central Valley out of the most severe drought level. However, the southern half of the state missed out on that rain, and so therefore you see an almost identical pattern at the end of November to the one observed at the end of October. That being said, we did just get through an impressively wet December, and this time the rain also fell on the southern part of the state, so there is a chance that we'll see bigger savings next month statewide. Next slide, please. Each month, our team provides a conservation tip, so our tip this month is follow the rules. As we just got through one of our wettest months in quite a while, we wanted to call attention to two of the wasteful water uses that the proposed emergency regulation would prohibit: irrigating when it's raining and more than incidental runoff caused by over irrigating landscapes. In the past 2 months, we have seen how much less potable water Californians use when we turn off our irrigation systems and rely instead on rainfall to keep our landscapes healthy. More than incidental runoff caused by over irrigating landscapes is not only a wasteful use of water, it is a significant source of pollutants considered an illicit discharge and prohibited by the municipal separate storm sewer system permits issued by several of our regional boards. In short, following the rules not only conserves water, it also helps protect California's water quality. So these are just a couple of the proposed statewide regulations that Chris will be explaining in more detail. But we do also encourage Californians to find out more about local regulations in their service area. I'm going to pause here and see if any board members have any questions on the conservation update. Otherwise, I will hand it over to Chris.
All right, seeing no questions. Thank you, Ms. Roderio.
All right, thanks, Marielle. Good morning, Vice Chair and board members. Again, I'm Chris Hyun, State Water Board Staff Climate Lead, and I've been helping to coordinate the logistics of the proposed emergency regulation along with staff and council who are also here with me to help with comments and questions. So for clarification, this is still item 4, but part 2 of item 4, and I'm presenting on the proposed drought conservation emergency regulation. Next slide, please. To start with, I'll give a little context, building on the drought update we just had. The water conservation report Marielle just presented was on November. However, for even more recent context, here are California conditions as of the end of December 2021, showing that 100% of California is still experiencing moderate to exceptional drought. Next slide, please. The last couple of years have shown that there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to water supply. Drought is a dry subject, but it keeps us on our toes. What we're looking at here is snow water content in the Sierras. We see that on December 30th, snow water content was over 100% of average, and that's great. However, looking ahead toward the end of the rainy season, this snow represents less than 60% of the April 1st average snow water content. April 1st is important because it signifies the historical end of the rainy season. After April 1st, there's normally very little rainfall. So while we're above average for December, we're only about halfway to seasonal average. Even if the past month has been great, it doesn't get us out of drought if the rest of the winter is still dry. Next slide, please. We've seen this in the past. Take the 2013 water year, for example. The December 2012 snowpack was quite similar to what we see today in December 2021, about half of seasonal average and over 100 of normal for December 30th. However, by April 2013, it all dropped to half and even down to 34% of normal. The percents of April 1st or end of season average also decreased. This suggests that water supply for this year is still uncertain. We can see this uncertainty historically in the graph on the right, which shows percents of April 1st or end of season average. In red, you can see the 2013 water year starting strong, but dropping in March, continuing the drought all the way until 2017. When, as you can see in blue, the winter actually started poorly, but had a strong finish. So snow or no snow, you never know. All that to say, we're happy that this past December has provided much needed relief, but we're not out of the woods yet. And it behooves us to continue toward water-wise practices. Next slide, please. So here's a brief timeline so far on the statewide emergency regulation that we're proposing today. In response to the governor's statewide drought emergency proclamation on October 19, 2021, a notice with the proposed regulation was sent out and posted in November. A state water board comment period ran until December 23rd. Today, we are considering adopting a resolution on the emergency regulation. The emergency regulation may come into effect before the end of this month, depending on how the process goes through the Office of Administrative Law, or OAL. Folks can find information on the proposed regulation on the Conservation Emergency Regulations webpage as shown on the slide. For the rest of my presentation, I'll go over what is actually prohibited in the proposed emergency regulation, then touched on a few frequently asked questions, and finally, I'll go over how comments have been addressed so far. Next slide, please. So what's currently in the proposed regulation? In order to promote water conservation, the use of potable water is prohibited in the proposed emergency regulation for the following. A, the application of potable water to outdoor landscapes in a manner that causes more than incidental runoff. B, the use of a hose that dispenses water to wash a motor vehicle, except where the hose is fitted with a shutoff nozzle or device attached to it that causes it to cease dispensing water immediately when not in use. C, the use of potable water for washing sidewalks, driveways, buildings, structures, patios, parking lots, or other hard surfaced areas, except in cases where health and safety are at risk. D, the use of potable water for street cleaning or construction site preparation unless no other method can be used or as needed to protect the health and safety of the public. E, the use of potable water for decorative fountains or filling or topping off of decorative lakes or ponds, with exceptions for those decorative fountains, lakes, or ponds that use pumps to recirculate water and only require refilling to replace evaporative losses. F, the application of water to irrigate turf and ornamental landscapes during and within 48 hours of measurable rainfall of at least 1/4 of 1 inch of rain. And finally, G, the use of potable water for irrigation of turf on public street medians. Now I'll go over some frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. First, are there exemptions from the prohibitions under certain circumstances? Yes, the proposed regulation includes a health and safety exemption to allow the otherwise prohibited water use practices to address reasonable and legitimate health and safety needs. Examples include controlling nuisance dust, suppressing fires, removing pathogenic waste from sidewalks, such as animal waste, and using potable water in fountains that are likely to have human direct contact. Next slide. Second, will the prohibition on using potable water for irrigating turf on public street medians allow communities to irrigate trees? Yes. The regulation only prohibits watering turf. Trees may be watered on street medians and parkways. Though the prohibition emphasizes that California should get off the lawn, we recognize that trees are a route to social and environmental benefits, such as shade, carbon sequestration, and habitats. They also reduce energy use by shading buildings, reduce heat island effects and associated health impacts, absorb and filter storm runoff and urban flooding, and protect air quality. So for more information on taking care of trees while saving water, you can go to the Save Our Water, Save Our Trees webpage as shown on the slide. Next slide, please. Another frequently asked question is, what is incidental runoff? Incidental runoff means unintended amounts of runoff, such as unintended minimal overspray from sprinklers that escapes the area of intended use. The proposed emergency regulation prohibits the application of potable water on landscapes that causes more than incidental runoff. The water should not leave an intended use area due to excessive application or intentional overflow or negligence. Next slide. Also an important question, should I skip irrigation due to rain? Yes. If it rained or is going to rain, you should change your irrigation schedule, especially if there are puddles. If you're unsure, you can check the weather online. Also, I emphasize again that you can still water trees. So some may ask, why do we need an emergency regulation while it's raining? Thanks, Vice Chair, for emphasizing this. As Marielle showed earlier, during the past couple of months, we've seen significant water savings, at least in part due to communities not watering lawns during and immediately after rain events. So we see major water savings during times of rainfall. So when it rains, refrain from spraying. Next slide. The proposed emergency regulation also addresses homeowners associations, or HOAs. The most common complaints the State Water Board receives during drought are about HOAs attempting to enforce their landscaping rules and homeowners having limited recourse. In this case, HOAs would be in violation of the Davis-Sterling Act, which makes landscaping guidelines unenforceable if they prohibit low water-using plants, turf replacement, or artificial turf, or if they restrict compliance with an emergency regulation. This applies to HOAs, community service organizations, or other similar entities. Likewise, in government code, cities and counties are similarly prohibited from restricting certain drought responses. Next slide. This is the final frequently asked question, and then I'll go on to how comments have been addressed. Where can someone report water waste or violations of these prohibitions? The easiest and most helpful way a person may file a complaint of water waste is by accessing safewater.ca.gov. This is an online portal that is easily accessible from smartphones and other devices via a web browser like Chrome or Safari. And it lets anyone file a water waste complaint. This website also allows you to upload photos of the activity, which helps with making decisions about enforcement. Once the complaint is submitted, it automatically goes to the local water supplier and the State Water Board. Now on to my final two slides about how comments have been addressed so far. Next slide. The State Water comment period started on November 30th and ended on December 23rd, 2021. In general, there was support for the proposed emergency regulation with several recommendations, including several requests to edit the regulation language. The median and parkways prohibition was of particular concern, especially to prevent tree mortality and clarity on which medians and parkways, as initially proposed, were included. Clarity was also requested on exemptions for both the street cleaning and construction prohibition and the impervious surface prohibition. Edits were also requested regarding measuring rainfall, in particular related to regional climate differences. Other than edits and clarification of the proposed regulation text, some other concerns were also highlighted, such as recognition of local water shortage contingency plans, or WSCPs, additional resources for enforcement, the need for more public education, and the need to consider agricultural water use. Next slide. I'll go over this final slide and then hand it back over to the board. All comments on the draft emergency regulation were reviewed, and staff proposes the changes to the regulation text you can see here, which were also provided as change sheet number 1. Changes have not been recommended by staff in response to every single comment received, but these proposed changes reflect consideration of the totality of comment input. The recommendation is to edit the language of two prohibitions, both under Section 995B1. For Section 995B1D, it is recommended to add the phrases site preparation and or as needed. These phrases clarify that the prohibition on using potable water does not apply to all uses of water for construction activities, such as mixing concrete, and it only applies to construction site preparation if no other method is available. For Section 995B1G, it is recommended to add the word ornamental and remove the phrase or publicly owned or maintained landscape areas between street and sidewalk. This removes the prohibition against using potable water to irrigate turf on parkways, which are generally the area between the sidewalk and the street. It now only prohibits irrigating with potable water turf on medians, meaning the area in between two portions of a roadway. As edited, the language essentially mirrors the language used during the last drought. We recognize that this change will make the prohibition less restrictive and save less water, but it will remove a significant source of confusion and uncertainty, making it much easier to implement. Water Agency likely made changes in the last drought regarding irrigation medians, so limiting the prohibition in this matter shouldn't lead to significant new costs or have a notable potential impact on trees. So thank you. And with that, I'd like to recommend on behalf of staff that the board adopt the resolution and regulation with change sheet number 1.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hune. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues for any questions. Okay, hearing none. We'll now go to public comment. Starting with the mayor of the city of Santa Clarita, Ms. Weste.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Chair Diadamo and members of the State Water Resources Control Board. I am the mayor of City of Santa Clarita, and I'm Lorraine West. I am honored to speak to you today on behalf of Santa Clarita City Council, and we are here to support the recommended changes that you have made on subsection G, Article 2 of Section 995 regarding proposed drought tolerant related emergencies. I did want to thank you for going through such extensive information for us. It is very helpful for our city. And we would like to thank you for your service on this critically important board and consideration of my comments. Thank you very much for all you're doing.
And thank you, Mayor West, for your leadership. We appreciate you taking the time to appear before us today. Next, we have Jeff Stevenson from the San Diego County Water Authority. Good morning.
Thank you, Vice Chair Diadamo, members of the board. My name is Jeff Stevenson, and like you said, I represent the San Diego County Water Authority. I want to comment on two things. As mentioned during the presentation, the southern part of the state received little to no rain in November, which explains the water use numbers for November. But I expect to see the December numbers to swing the other way. We did have a lot of rainfall in the southern part of the state, so I expect to see significant reductions in December's numbers. I also want to comment and say that the Water Authority supports the proposed drought-related emergency regulations. And thank you for considering the comments that were submitted through the Aqua letter that included the turf on street medians and parkways. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Ryan Ohagian. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, with the Regional Water Authority. Good morning.
That's okay. It's Ojakian, and good morning, Vice Chair and board members. Happy New Year as well. So my name is Ryan Ojakian with the Regional Water Authority. We submitted comments and are very thankful to see that the issues that we raised in our comment letters have been addressed by and large by the changes. So really just want to express our appreciation and thanks want to highlight some of the things that were hit on. We think that these regs are very important still. I know everybody's excited about how the water year has started, but we need to see how it plays out. So we actually think that it's quite timely because we think that it's important messaging. One of the things that was in the actual notice was one of the potential benefits is, increased public awareness. So we're very supportive of that because that is, at the end of the day, it's our users who we're relying on to participate in drought response. So really appreciate the consideration for trees in particular. That was one of the primary things in our comments, and really appreciate the responsiveness on that. As was noted in the Natural Resources Agency report on drought. The last drought, the 2012 to 2016 drought, was the first drought where we really saw significant urban tree mortality. So we really, and I know that this board has consistently hit on this point, but we think that it's really important that in every way that we're really messaging on that, the importance to recognize that we maintain our trees even as we move forward with increased efficiency. So again, thanks for the recognition of that issue, as well as the issue on construction water, and really appreciate the board's responsiveness. And with that, I will conclude my comments other than to say we are also very supportive of the comments that were made by Aqua. Thanks, appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mr. Ojakian. Next, we have Natalie Escobedo Garcia from the Leadership Council.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. My name is Natalie, calling in on behalf of Leadership Council to express concerns and provide comments regarding the proposed drought regulations for urban water use. While we support the state's effort to reduce water waste during drought, we are concerned these regulations could have adverse impact on low-income households. In order to reduce potential impacts, we suggest the board consider the following recommendations before adopting these regulations. First, before any fines are imposed, households should receive one or more warnings and be given ample time to address waste, especially in the event waste is due to leaks in piping. Additionally, warnings must be in preferred language spoken in the home, and in the event costly piping repairs are required to stop the waste, the board should have funding set aside to support these costs. Second, any fines imposed must be to an ability to pay determination. If this is not possible, we suggest a much lower maximum fine for low-income households, and preferably nothing higher than $50. Third, these fines cannot result in shutoff of water services for inability to pay. Fines may not be collected without offering a payment plan over at least 12 months without interest, and collection of fines shall not result in a tax lien. Last, we continue to warn that without accompanying regulations on agricultural overpumping, the gains made by urban water regulation will be minuscule at best. Thank you for your time and consideration.
And thank you. I'd like to ask staff, Mr. Hune, if you could respond to some of the concerns that were just raised by Ms. Garcia.
At least for the language portion, we do encourage in the State Water Board resolution that water suppliers provide information in local languages that are used. And I'll hand it over to Eric, Mr. Altner.
Thanks, Chris. Morning, everybody. Good comments from Ms. Escobedo. And of course, it's not our intent that these regulations would cause an undue burden on any, residents of California. I actually, would like some input from legal counsel because generally, what the regulation does is provide a lot of discretion to local municipalities and local water suppliers. It doesn't require any of them to issue fines, and it doesn't require, if they do issue fines, that they're in the amount of $500. It just authorizes up to that amount. I'll just say, based on, my experience with very similar prohibitions during the last drought, that this generally was not an issue that I was aware of. And if it was, and there's input on that, I would appreciate hearing it. My experience was that most suppliers did amplify their outreach and compliance and enforcement activities during the last drought. They hired staff, they brought them on board. The staff did increase surveillance of neighborhoods and things like that. But the general tendency was for enforcement really to be more compliance assistance, where they would do things like leave door hangers with information about how to save water. They would respond to complaints that were received through the water waste portal and go out and try to help people reduce or eliminate the violations of the prohibited uses. And in some instances, we did collect information where fines were issued. That this was usually for flagrant violations or repeated violations. I do not recall, and I don't think any fine was ever issued, anywhere near the $500 mark. Again, there's discretion. Where I'm interested in hearing some input from from our council is I don't think we have the authority to limit what local municipalities can do through this regulation. We can encourage it. We could, the board, if this remains a concern, could put more or new resolution language that made our intent clear and recommended some of the consideration of some of the factors that Ms. Escobedo brought up. But I'm not sure legally we can somehow constrain the authority of cities and counties and public water agencies. And David's on and he can speak to this.
I agree with everything Eric said about our lessons learned from the last drought and how the enforcement rolled out. In general, what occurred in the last drought with nearly identical language as to the prohibitions and to the enforcement sections was that there was a tremendous outreach approach taken by each of the suppliers and by board staff using generally existing resources, but some redirected resources here and there. Those resources were focused on compliance assistance and hanging flyers, warning letters for egregious situations. I think one of the concerns raised was broken pipes. That's not the sort of thing that itself leads to a violation of the regulation. We are separately undertaking a water loss proceeding that would look at leaks and things like that. But for this, it's really intended to address solely those discretionary water use activities that can be, in many cases, accomplished by the rain. And so we are taking our lessons learned from the last drought and what occurred then. And I think Eric said it best in saying that I don't believe that there were any fines of up to $500. There were, I believe, a small handful throughout the state of smaller fines after multiple levels of warnings and outreach. But mostly what the suppliers chose to do was to implement their own existing water waste or water use restrictions as opposed to the board's regulation. But in general, we heard appreciation on the messaging side of things from suppliers, in that we were all sort of speaking with one voice about the types of things that shouldn't be occurring. So I'll also agree with Eric about a limited ability for the board to restrict the enforcement discretion of any entity in choosing to how to implement their own regulations, certainly, but even in enforcing ours. We can certainly, the board can certainly direct staff, like Eric and Chris said, by way of the resolution in how to roll out certain types of enforcement from the board whether for all the prohibitions or for any particular ones. And that's entirely within your discretion to do if you choose to do so. And the resolution is probably a good place to do that, although that's also how board staff already consider enforcement in the last drought and currently. So I don't know if that answers your questions. Hopefully it does, but if not, I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you for that. I think, Ms. Garcia, are you still there? I'd like to better understand your concern about the leaky pipes. And so just looking at the list, if we could pull up slide 13, just to refresh our memories here about the different activities that are prohibited. I'm not seeing the leaky pipe connection except perhaps on the incidental runoff, but I don't want to assume as to what you're talking about. So, as to your concerns. So if you could help us to connect the dots between leaky pipes, and I particularly am concerned about this issue for our water loss proposal that we'll be looking at, but I'm not necessarily seeing it here. So help to educate us, please. Looks like we may have lost her.
I
Ms.
have asked
Townsend?
her to unmute, but she's not clicking. So I've just done it again.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll continue with public comment. We only have one more speaker, and then we can, as part of our discussion on this, go back to these points. All right. Our last public commenter is Chelsea Haynes from the Association of California Water Agencies. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Happy 2022. Thanks for the opportunity to provide comments today. My name is Chelsea Haynes, and I'm providing comments on behalf of the Association of California Water Agencies. And just to start out, consistent with Vice Chair Diadamo's earlier characterization, we've really appreciated the State Water Board and this administration's measured approach to responding to this drought and integrating the lessons learned from the previous drought. So thank you for your work. ACWA and our member agencies take very seriously California's drought emergency and the associated challenges on water management. And so we're continuing to actively encourage water agencies and customers to reduce water use and to meet the governor's call to achieve the voluntary 15% water reduction. And we submitted comments on December 22nd. And so really appreciate a lot of those comments being included in the presentation that Chris provided today. Specifically, we really appreciate the changes to proposed section 995B1G and to 995B1D in order to minimize the impacts to shade trees and construction. So really supportive of those changes. And then just wanted to briefly raise one other comment that I didn't hear addressed, although Chris mentioned it in his overview, which was regarding measurable rainfall. And this is in section 995B1F. And so the emergency regulation includes a specific metric of at least 1/4 of an inch of rain. And we had suggested for that, rather than including that specific metric, deferring to the local water shortage contingency plans, which sometimes have a different metric in it. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we're not inconsistent with some of the local water shortage contingency plan metrics. And so I guess just wanted to flag that one more time for a little bit of opportunity for discussion. We had in our track changes suggested some red lines that would say as an amount specified in water shortage contingency plans or a local ordinance or resolution, just to allow for a little bit of consistency with local plans. So wanted to flag that, but otherwise we really appreciate the State Water Board's approach, the opportunity for comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And apologize because you probably don't have our red lines in front of you at this moment.
Okay, Mr. Hune, could you speak to sort of your thinking about leaving it versus making any changes?
Sure, I'll actually hand it over to Eric Oppenheimer, who has his video open.
Yeah, so as Chris said in the presentation, we did consider the totality of the comments, and we made a couple of fairly surgical changes that I think addressed a lot of the comments, and I think they're good changes. We're recommending that you make them. On the 1/4 inch of rain issue, we're not recommending making that change and essentially deferring to each water shortage contingency plan. Basically, the thinking here is that in the interest of clarity and consistency, it's better just to have a uniform number across the state. It's just going to get very complicated and I think somewhat arcane if we defer to water shortage contingency plans. I'm not sure, and perhaps Ms. Haynes could answer this. I'm not sure if every water shortage contingency plan actually specifies a number or only some of them do. But regardless, the main reason was just to keep it simple, to keep it clear, to keep it consistent. I'll also just mention that when we adopted similar prohibitions in the last drought, 2014-15, this prohibition actually did not have a numeric piece to it. It was just measurable. You couldn't irrigate within 48 hours of measurable rainfall. And my recollection at that time was that there was a request that a number be included. And I think at that time it was recommended it be a 1/4 inch. Bottom line is, it's certainly up to the board to decide whether they'd like to make the change. But as staff, for the reasons I mentioned, we're just recommending to keep it as is.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, thank you, Ms. Haynes. Okay, Ms. Townsend, unless there have been any others that have signed up late, I'm not seeing any other public commenters on the list.
We do have one more. It was a speak if necessary, but we should offer Miss Evans if she needs to speak now.
Okay.
And let me just hold on one second. Actually, she has responded to me and she says she has nothing to say.
All right.
So
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Okay, let's just turn it over to discussion now. Any comments? Any further thoughts from my fellow colleagues?
Yeah, I have some comments and maybe questions. And we can go into, I think the 2 areas that were brought up in particular today. I mean, I think more generally, I want to say that I'm going to vote for this because I think we're in a declared drought emergency. This is a very temporary emergency policy, and I do think it sends a really important message that we're still in the drought. It's critical that everyone does their part. And, fundamentally, these are not only inefficient, but really do seem to be unreasonable wastes of water generally, and in particular when we're in a drought. So, and then finally, I do think it's very important that that homeowners associations and other local restrictions don't prevent really vital conservation and efficiency measures that we all need to be taking. I think this issue is really important piece of this, and I know as something that also has been discussed and identified as a priority within the legislature. I will say though, there's a number of pretty major concerns that make this vote a lot harder for me than I would have liked. The first is this issue of penalties. In general, there really aren't consumer protections around penalties within the water sector. We've learned with our experience in the arrearages context that inability to pay can have really significant consequences, including water shutoffs and tax liens. And so to the extent that we are establishing penalties, I would want to make sure that we as a board are not compounding that equity problem with our actions at the board. So I understand, that issue of consumer protections for penalties within water is something really for the legislature and local agencies to address. But to the extent that we are establishing penalties, I think it's important that we ensure that our actions aren't compounding that problem. And in general, what I would like to see is some kind of link to the ability to pay. If we're considering anything like this in the future, I would really want to see that, some kind of link to ability to pay. I think more, so happy to go back and discuss that. More fundamentally, and I think this goes to the point that Chelsea raised in that discussion, this is not the most effective or even in my mind appropriate policy approach to save water when we're in a drought emergency. So I think we all agree that a more systemic level overall water use is really what matters in a drought emergency. So having some performance standard approach rather than mandates on specific individual behavior is what is an effective, more equitable and appropriate regulatory approach in my mind. And I think unfortunately, like in the last drought, we don't have a more appropriate and effective policy developed that we go to in drought emergencies. So in the last drought, we had to go to kind of one size fits all, everyone reduce a certain percentage. And we did a little bit of tweaking of that to recognize there's some differences in individual systems. But I think we also recognize that that's not the approach we want to be stuck taking in a drought emergency. And similar to what we're doing in the context of curtailments, TUCPs, what we're asking the urban water agencies to do in terms of establishing water shortage contingency plans and drought contingency plans. I think we really need to be working on developing our methodology and sort of structural approach that we're going to use when we find ourselves in an emergency. So we should be working on this same, developing our approach to water conservation regulation that when we will be forced to act in future emergencies, so that we're in a better position and don't continue to find ourselves in having to go to, what I think is really not an efficient or effective way of, or equitable way of addressing the emergencies that we're in and reducing the water that we need to as a state. So we're developing conservation regulations as, we're in the process of doing that. We talked about water loss as, establishing what an efficient use of water needs to be and is going forward. And that's really to make conservation a way of life more permanently. But for an emergency context, we need to be able to better define what a basic amount of water for human health and safety should be and needs to be for ensuring that we can protect and prioritize that in a drought emergency. And then also, more relevant to these types of regulations is how we might structure the reductions needed when we're in a severe emergency in the future. So, I'll just note, this is really important, I think, also in the water rights context as well, where we're talking about protecting basic human health and safety needs. I think those two summarize, I think we all agree we need to do our part. These are no-brainer actions. And we need to make sure that we're helping that message be heard across California. And I do hope that as this, I hope that this action can give us more urgency to both speed up the process of establishing the kind of long-term conservations and efficiency standards, but also working on establishing a more appropriate and effective approach to emergency conservation and sort of definition of basic human health and safety. and then that we can be working on or learning from this as to the extent we are developing penalties, especially for individual actions, that we ensure that there's a more equitable approach that we can build in. I'm certainly open to adjusting resolution language to address that. I think in practical terms, this is a very temporary regulation. So, and I'm not sure how much, I don't think we really have full data on how this, was or wasn't fully applied in the past drought. So happy to consider that. It sounds like, I think I'm particularly want to make sure that this is a good learning direction for us for future penalties and anything that would be more long-term.
Thank you, Board Member Firestone. Other members? Board members, any comments?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Vice Chair. I think those were very astute comments from Board Member Firestone. I appreciate the input there and the mindfulness about sort of the short-term nature of these measures, and really, I think the importance of sending out a clear and consistent signal statewide. One of the questions I had was just clarification on whether this applies truly statewide or just to urban water systems. And this, as was explained to me, applies to all Californians, local governments, regardless of the system size. And so it brings to mind a lot of the issues, Board Member Firestone, that you brought up about equity, about how this is actually administered on a local level at different scales and what those impacts are. So to the extent that this should be used, we should be collecting good information here to the extent we can about how this is implemented. And how penalties, if they are administered, how those are administered through different communities. I think that we are in a place where it's an awkward place. We're developing our regulations, making conservation of California a way of life. I think that will be the standard going forward. However, that won't address all emergencies. It won't address all drought shortages. And we heard some really good, I think, information from Division of Drinking Water in the earlier item about looking at small water systems, about some of the water shortage challenges that they may be facing now, could be facing this coming year. And it's a reminder to me that there's a lot to be said for public education and having a consistent message. I think for me, this is where this regulation hits, is saying, hey, these are just the practical, everyday things that we all can be doing, regardless of where we are in the state, regardless of our situation. I think everyone can have a shut-off nozzle on their hose when they're washing their car. Just some basic things like that. That I think, yes, agreed. Maybe it won't save a ton of water. It probably won't if you look at each of these individually. But on scale, as we get into the warmer months here, if this drought is continuing, I think these types of measures and a general public education and awareness enhancement through this are going to help with that mindset about water savings, about that we're all in this together. And this is the right step going forward. Yes, this is a little bit of an awkward moment to be doing this in early January, but I think as we're thinking proactively here, teeing us up for the year to be ready for whatever may come is within the spirit of what we need to be doing. It's been something very important to me as a board member from the moment I was first appointed, thinking about drought preparedness and readiness and what kind of actions we can have in the hopper, what tools we can have in the toolbox, if you will, so we're not scrambling at the last moment and having to take, just doing all of our thinking in that emergency. So actually, Board Member Firestone, your other point about the performance metrics and just some discussion, I think, and thinking through what that could look like. Not knowing where this drought will go, but either in the shorter term or in the longer term, I would really appreciate some further conversation about that. And what we did learn from the last drought, I think there was some adaptation there of going through the blunt approach of everybody conserve X% to really looking at system by system, their individual situation, going to the stress test approach, and really trying to tailor the conservation savings based on the needs of each system. I think that's some of what we heard from Division of Drinking Water earlier, as they look at their drought watch list, about where they fall on the watch list and the types of actions that may be needed or beneficial there to those water systems. So I think we're all talking about the same thing as I hear it. And so I think some just brainstorming, gathering some input on what that should look like, what we learned, and just being prepared to have that in the tool belt in case it's needed at some point in the coming months or years, I think would be very much appreciated. I'd be open to if staff, if there are some suggestions on resolution language that might help clarify some of the the equity concerns about administration of penalties. I'd be open to that as well. I was looking at the resolution. I'm not quite exactly sure where that would best fit, so I'd be looking for some input on that. And also, I think we can help perhaps emphasize that maybe through our FAQs or any other outreach that we may be doing directly to counties that we're working with or others, water systems, just to signal to them that this is not, it's a maximum. And certainly we are very supportive of progressive compliance assistance type approaches for everyone, frankly. And so that's something that we really should emphasize and just support that this is, and we'll learn and adapt as we go. And then the last comment, I just wanted to address the aqua comment on the measurable rainfall, and appreciate your input on that, Mr. Oppenheimer. I agree with you. I think it's good to have a standard here just for consistency and ease of understanding. The only exception I might consider, I looked at the aqua comment letter, and they used an example of a water system that had a 0.1 inch trigger, which is less than a quarter. And so, if there were a situation where a community has one that's actually more protective, that would be okay with me. I don't know if that works within the regulation as it's currently written, but if you could let me know about that. But otherwise, it seems okay to leave it as it is. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Board Member McGuire. I actually agree with what you've just said, and I've got the resolution opened up here. And whereas number 15 reads, nothing in the regulation or enforcement of the regulation precludes a local agency from exercising its authority to adopt more stringent conservation measures. So I think that that 0.1 agency should be covered. Board Member Morgan, did you have any comments that you wanted to add?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, well, so as we proceed here as to adoption or any other changes, I just want to put out there that I really appreciate Leadership Council's comments. I think it's important, especially with the resolution that we just adopted on racial equity, to be, always looking at things through that lens. I'm comfortable, though, looking at how broadly written number 15 is, but I too am open to changes if others, think that would be helpful. I'm just looking here at the bottom of number 15. It does indicate that local agencies retain their enforcement discretion in enforcing the regulation to the extent authorized and may develop their own progressive enforcement practices to encourage conservation. So that doesn't specifically say warnings first, but it I think is broad enough to encompass that sort of enforcement policy. So I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Oppenheimer, and also Mr. Kuhn, to see, get your thoughts if there's any further tweaking that we may want to consider. But also just want to indicate that I think that this discussion is going to be front and center as we move forward on the 3 efficiency regulations that we'll be considering this year and into next year. So again, really appreciate Leadership Council highlighting their concerns today. Mr. Oppenheimer?
Yes. So we can, if the board would like, we can certainly augment the language that's in the resolution to clarify that, like, as I said earlier, it's not our intent that the any fines issued pursuant to the regulation or even any local authority cause an undue burden on in disadvantaged communities or on low-income individuals. And we could even point to the factors, and we could recommend that local entities consider the factors that Ms. Garcia, and apologies to Ms. Garcia for calling her Ms. Escobedo. I could only read part of her nameplate on the Zoom platform, but so we can definitely do that. It's really up to you. Maybe give us like 10 minutes to come up with some proposed language to add, and if you'd like that, we can do that. With respect to the concern about the State Water Board issuing fines, I will say it is true that we have the authority to issue fines up to $500 to individuals. I can say with certainty, though, that like in the last drought, we had the same authority and we didn't do that. I don't anticipate that the board would be issuing fines to individuals. I don't think that's where we put our resources. I think our authority would be reserved for taking actions against water suppliers or municipalities, only if needed, of course. And so what I mean there is, let's say there was a city that continued to irrigate ornamental turf in medians. That would be an area where, we'd sort of be the appropriate entity to go in and enforce the prohibition. But I think, as a general matter, we'll be looking to public water agencies and cities and counties to take the lead on enforcing on the individual household level. So just that with respect to our authority. And then again, if you would like, we can propose some additional resolution language that is a little more clear and speaks more directly to Ms. Garcia's comments and the factors that she brought up.
Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break and hear back from you as to any recommended changes.
That sounds good. And for the staff, just I'll set up a quick Teams meeting right now, and let's jump on that and confer, and we'll be back. Can you give us maybe 15 minutes?
Yeah, let's meet again at 11 o'clock.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, it is now 11 o'clock and we are back. Just making sure everyone's here. Okay, Mr. Oppenheimer.
Yeah, hello. So yes, we've met and discussed proposed changes to the resolution that we hope are responsive to the comments we received from Leadership Council and from the board members. Chris Kuhn, if you could bring up the proposed changes to the resolution, and David Rose will just kind of walk through what they are and the thinking behind them.
Good morning again. I think this reflects what I heard in the comments from the board members and the public here. But what staff are proposing in response is addition of a new, therefore be it resolved, paragraph 15 that goes in between pre-existing paragraph 14 and what was 15, which would be moved to 16, and then in a minor addition to new paragraph, or sorry, to move to paragraph 16. And I'll read it out, and then I can explain it. But what staff is recommending adding is new paragraph resolved 15. The board directs staff to consider the following in pursuing any enforcement of section 995 subdivision B1 capital A through capital F : before imposing monetary penalties, staff shall provide one or more warning : monetary penalties must be based on an ability to pay determination. Consider allowing a payment plan of at least 12 months and shall not result in a tax lien, and board enforcement shall not result in shutoff. And then staff also proposes adding as a new first sentence to what was resolved paragraph 15, now moved to paragraph 16. The board encourages entities other than board staff that consider any enforcement of this regulation to apply these same factors identified in resolved paragraph 15. And that's the totality of the proposed changes. I can walk through the intent of those if it's not self-evident, or if you have any questions.
I think those
Thank
are
you.
great. Yeah, I don't have any questions, and I think that's a really good way of addressing what we have control over, and then helping to share that intent with others for their own enforcement.
And as you noted, Board Member Firestone, we are engaged in a number of other long-term processes, and so we're definitely going to take your comments to heart on those as well, to the extent that they have something akin to this regulation in directly hitting homeowners. So thank you for the points.
All right. I agree. I think it's an improvement, and I appreciate your putting this together. Any other comments or questions? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
No other comments from me. I really appreciate all the work that staff put into this. I know this has been a very fast-paced development of an emergency regulation over the course of, I think, about a month. So thank you for your stewardship here and just keeping this and shepherding this through to getting it onto the agenda today. I really appreciate it. And I know it's not lost on me how much is going on and how this was just one more thing to throw into your busy workload already. So thank you. I'm happy to make a motion, and I'll try to get this right. So I'll move to adopt the item with, we don't have a change sheet, so I'll just say the changes read into the record by staff and Office of Chief Counsel.
All right. We have a motion for the adoption of the resolution with the changes read into the record by staff. Do we have a second?
Vice Chair Diadama, I do believe there was mention of a change sheet in the beginning of the presentation.
Oh.
Is there a change sheet?
It was
Mr.
not.
Rose?
Mr. Huen, sorry, did put the changes up on the screen as part of the presentation. I'm not sure if that made its way to you as a change sheet with a number.
It did not.
If it did not, then
No.
then I think that the motion correctly referred to the changes as read into the record by Mr. Hune and the changes to the resolution language. Apologies for that oversight that there's not a change sheet with a number.
Thank you, Ms. Townsend, for bringing that to our attention. All right, do we have a second?
I'll second the motion.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Ms. Townsend, please call the roll.
Yes. Board Member McGuire.
Aye.
Board Member Morgan.
Aye.
Board Member Firestone.
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo.
Aye.
Thank you all.
4-0, the motion carries. And thank you all for your work on this, and appreciate the good work and the message that this hopefully sends, that despite all of the good precipitation that we've been seeing, the drought continues and our work continues. All right, with that, we will move on to item number 5, board member report. Does anyone have anything to report? Okay.
I don't have a report,
Hearing-
but sorry, but I do want to I know we are we've passed the deadline that we'd set for arrearage submissions for funding for drinking water systems, and I know the deadline for getting that money out is quickly approaching for on the drinking water side. And it'd be great to get an update from staff on what that looks like on the drinking water side, ideally for the next board meeting, but as soon as we can, just so that we understand where that is, and appreciate all the work that's gone into that program. And I know we have, we're in the midst of developing the guidelines for wastewater.
All right, thank you for that, Board Member Firestone. So I believe at this point, I could use a little bit of help from Mr. Sawyer. I believe at this point, we will be going into recess, reconvening tomorrow morning. We have a full agenda tomorrow, but we also have a closed session. And the closed session is a water rights item, not an administrative hearing office item, as was stated on the agenda. So I believe Office of Chief Counsel has something that needs to be indicated on the record before we close out here.
I'll check with Amanda, but I think you already covered it. Technically, we go into recess after the closed session. So we break for the closed session now, and then recess after it's completed, and then resume tomorrow morning.
All right. Very good. And then we will be doing that right at the close, and you've sent out information as to how to access.
Correct.
All right.
Also, Vice Chair, Council Amanda Pearson does need to say a couple of words regarding written comments.
Yes, thank you, Janine, and thank you, Vice Chair. Vice Chair covered the correction to the agenda. I also wanted to note that for this closed session item, we have received 2 letters from interested parties. We are not accepting letters into the record for this closed session item at this time. However, I wanted to state that staff plans to provide an opportunity to comment on this matter before the board's consideration of adoption of a proposed order.
All right, very good. Thank you. And then Mr. Sawyer, I just want to make sure as to going into recess after the closed session, Do we need to come back and do that on the record? Or we just go into closed session and then?
I can come back and I can come back on the record. It's not necessary for the board members to come back on the record.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. All right, so for the public, we'll be seeing you all tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and we'll be going into closed session immediately following. Thank you.